Thank y'all very much. I'm going to use a PowerPoint more as an outline, but first I want to thank a few people that I kind of personally invited that showed up. And I want to start with Dr. Frank Brown. He's former president here. He needs no introduction, but he's somebody I've covered for the better part of the last 30 years and have great respect for, and I really appreciate Dr. Brown being here. And I've got a bunch of colleagues from the WRBL. If the colleagues would stand up, I just want to make sure I got everybody. Vian Borg, who is our 6 o'clock producer, Hannah James, outstanding young reporter, who is working on her master's right now from the University of Alabama, Auburn degree, and Hannah's, you're going to see big things from both of these people. And then Phil Scoggins, who needs no introduction. Phil is one of our co-anchors. And my two bosses, Connor Hackling and Joe McGuire. Connor's news director, and Joe is the one who gets in trouble for everything we do as the general manager. So those are there, and there's some others from the community that are here, and thank y'all for being here. Brittany Santiago's Public Affairs from the Columbus Police Department, Betsy Covington, who is with the Community Foundation, Ken Henson, who's a longtime friend and probably could, if you want this to be entertaining, just let Ken come up here and tell you stuff about me, and he could take it over from there. But this is what I want to do. I want to talk about 40 years. I've been a journalist for 40 years. Graduated from Troy State University, and I started as a sports guy. I made the transition to news in 1997. At the Ledger-Inquirer, I spent almost 30 years there. I did everything from being sports editor, did some sports columnist stuff. Best job in journalism used to be a sports columnist. Far and away the best job for a traditional old newspaper. Not many of those jobs exist anymore. But then I became a business editor. I became an investigative reporter. I was a government reporter, a politics reporter. You know, I did everything but a managing editor. I was a Metro editor. And I used to joke, I kept changing jobs every 2 years, but I never lost my vacation. But I got put in all of these ethical situations over those 30 years there. And I want to talk about ethics, and there's a reason I put this picture up here to start. Ethics, and I'll get into the definition in just a minute, but nobody in our state, and I would argue in our country, over the last 2.5, 3 years, has faced more ethical decisions than the guy on that screen, Brad Raffensperger, Secretary of State at the University of Georgia. He has been at the center of a political controversy, and a lot of it, in interviews I've done with him, he said has come down to ethics. He has made his decisions based on his personal and professional ethics. And, you know, and when I was going through slides I was going to put up here, that struck me because I've interviewed Secretary Raffensperger a number of times, most recently about 2 months ago. He's the same, and he looks at ethics very differently than some people. He looks at it black, white, right, wrong. There's no gray area in the way he looks at ethical decisions. And I'm gonna get into some of that as we go through this, and let's see if I can run a PowerPoint now. Okay, this is the traditional definition of ethics, and it, as defined by Webster's. The principles of conduct governing an individual or a group. Pretty basic. I mean, it's just as simple as it gets. That's a on paper definition. You know, it also can come down to morals, creeds, right and wrong. I mean, ethics is an area that's defined by kind of doing the right thing, as my grandmom used to say, doing what's right when people aren't watching. It's your ethical makeup, sort of how you're defined. And, you know, one thing 40 years of doing this has taught me is it's not that easy. Most of what we do is in the gray area. And I'm gonna go here to, if you go to the Society of Professional Journalists web page, or there's actually a plaque in that room back behind you, an ethical journalist acts with integrity. That's it to me. That's what it all boils down to. One word, integrity. When you talk about ethics, you're talking about integrity. And integrity is doing the right thing. I mean, it's who you are. It's who a company is. It's who a person is. If you don't have integrity in what you report on, it will become very apparent to those that are the subjects of what you're reporting and those who are the consumers of what you're reporting. You know, and at the end of the day, the thing about integrity to me is it's the currency that allows a journalist to do his or her job. We don't have a lot of money. You don't pay for information. Traditional news organizations don't pay for information. All you have is your integrity. You have the ability for somebody to trust you with a story, or trust you with a set of facts, or trust you with a piece of information that leads to stories. That's it. Integrity is simply the currency in which reporters operate. It's that simple to me. And something Marion said in the intro was a piece of what I was going to talk about here. At the end of the day, I am less concerned whether somebody I cover likes me or not. You know, there are certainly people I become friends with. I'm not as concerned about whether people in general like me. I'm concerned if they disrespect me for a certain reason. Because of lack of respect for not doing your job or doing your job wrong or doing it without integrity, that's the quickest way to get my attention as a reporter. Somebody says, I don't respect what you do. Well, why don't you? Is it something specific? Have I done something wrong? And you know, as a reporter, you build relationships. That's how you cover stuff. You know, in a lot of ways, you know, there are people in this room that I've had long-term relationships with on the public relations side, and there are people like Brittany Santiago in the back of this room that I'm just now establishing relationships with. And fortunately, Brittany came out of the producer side. She worked at WTVM before she went to work for the city. And, you know, it helps when people kind of know what you do for a living. They know what your goal is and stuff. And, you know, I tell a story, I mean, and we're operating in really difficult times right now as journalists. There's not a lot of trust in our profession. I mean, look around. I mean, there are people that bash the mainstream media. They bash local journalists. And I would argue local journalists probably still have more respect by and large than some of the national folks. And I'll tell a story about Alton Russell. Many of you know Alton. He is the chairman of the Republican Party, or what, former chairman of the Republican Party here, political person in this town for many, many decades. And I was at a Republican deal during one of the recent election cycles, and I was at a Republican meeting, and all of a sudden it kind of got tough. I mean, they were going after the media and stuff, and I was the only journalist in the room. And I'm like, okay, this is coming at me. And then one or two kind of stretched it out and started to come after me. Alton stopped them. He said, whoa, wait a minute. That's Chuck. He's not a reporter. That's Chuck. And I'm like, that's good. Okay. But it was interesting that because he had a personal relationship with me, because he has seen how I have done my job, and he hasn't agreed with everything I've done. I mean, good gosh, I know he hasn't. But for him to say, whoa, wait a minute, he said it, he wouldn't have said that if Anderson Cooper had been sitting in there or somebody. He said it because it was a local reporter that he knew. And he knew my ethics. He knew my integrity, at least in my dealings with him. And he was able to step up and say, stop it. And I really, really appreciate that. Okay, the last thing I want to get to on this is you're probably looking at this slide going, what is this? Not all the ethical decisions are easy. Okay, this was in 2018 at a Kemp campaign rally in Macon, Georgia. The keynote speaker was President Trump. And I was in the pool reporters, and we got embedded. So we're embedded in this group, and we couldn't go anywhere. We were on lockdown. I mean, it was just Secret Service had already kind of said, you don't go past here, you're stuck. And we were going to get pretty good access to the president. And I had to go to the bathroom real bad, and we were embedded for a long time. If you look at this door, it says Trump Pence restroom POTUS. So that was obviously a restroom that was reserved for somebody that wasn't me. So I had a decision to make. Do I go into the president's bathroom or not? I looked around to see who was looking, and finally a woman goes, just go in there, I'll stand at the door. And so it was an ethical decision. I made the decision I was going to use the president's bathroom. And then when I came out, I was told, nobody's supposed to use that bathroom but the president. And I said, I'm sorry. Sometimes it's better to beg forgiveness than ask for permission. Life is an open mic. And for a journalist, it is so, so true. Everything you say, post online, just say in a conversation. I could be talking to Hannah at lunch about something and have no idea that there's somebody with a phone recording us in the next booth. I mean, you've got to be so, so careful in what you say and what you do. And the reason I've got this picture up, most of y'all may know that's Mark Jones. Mark Jones in 2020 wrote a wave of populism into the district attorney's office in Muskogee County. It was a campaign that was about everything and nothing at the same time. It was about legalizing marijuana. It was about, it was this strange campaign that worked. And all of a sudden, Mark Jones, who I knew had some ethical challenges, became our district attorney. But during the campaign, he was dodging me. And I don't really like it when people dodge me. I will chase them down. I won't be disruptive. I won't be disrespectful, but I just don't like it. And I don't deal with it very well, and I don't know where it comes from. But he started a Facebook Live over by the government center by his old office. And I was at the WRBL bureau right up the street. When he started that Facebook Live, I said, oh man, he's a block over. So I walked out of the office, and literally that picture is me walking into his Facebook Live. and that pretty much tells the story of Mark's tenure as DA. He looks confused, and I'm like, what are you doing? But Mark lasted 10 months before he was convicted of public corruption and sent to state prison. And, I wasn't the kind of guy Mark liked seeing around, because Mark knew what my job was. But I got so many, my phone blew up. They were like, dude, you're on Mark's Facebook Live. What were you doing? And he had turned it on me and started asking me questions. And it's like, so you've got to be careful. And I'm going to tell a story that I'm not particularly proud of, but it goes to why it's so important for journalists. And Connor knows this story well. He was in the middle of it. Journalists need to be careful what they say. I cover a lot of court, a lot of recorder's court, superior court. But I was in recorder's court, and that's a 72-hour hearing when the initial facts come out in a case. Basically what the police are alleging is presented, and the judge decides do they have probable cause to hold the person. And a guy was charged with murder, and he was being represented by an attorney that I have a lot of respect for. And I walked out of there, and the attorney was sitting there talking to somebody else that I knew, and I walked up to him, and I just said, dude, if I ever kill somebody, I'm coming straight to you and to hire you. The parents and the mother and the sister of the guy that was shot in this situation were within earshot of me. If I could have had that back, and about 5 hours later, they ended up in the WRBL office, and Connor had to deal with that because I made a flippant remark. I shouldn't have said it. It was, and I learned so much that day. Even 38 years into this job, that day I was like, whoa, dude, be careful what you say and be careful how you say it. It comes down to my ethics. I went against kind of what my general principles are. And, and if you know how I cover courts, I have a lot of banter with the lawyers because I've been covering a lot of those lawyers for a long time. And I'm very comfortable with the lawyers. I'm very comfortable with a lot of the police investigators that testify in court. I've known these folks. I know them well. And sometimes I will say stuff as a conversation starter, and I did in that case, and it was really tough. It created a situation that I should have never created for that family. And and I went home that night and I didn't sleep very well because I knew I had a family going through unimaginable pain with a murder victim. I had added to it by being an idiot. And that's where ethics come into play to me. You've got to think things through. And Mike Burbach, who's my editor at the Ledger-Enquirer, always said, don't say it if you don't want to see it on a billboard on Veterans Parkway. And that really is true. It's even more true now because everybody has a camera. Everybody has a microphone. They can get anything you say now, anything, and they will. I mean, I have watched as people have tried to record stuff while I'm talking to somebody in a public place. Be careful. And that's the advice I would give to the Hannahs and the Vians, that, you've got to really think it through sometimes. That is my beautiful wife, Kathy. And she is definitely on a slide with dealing with conflicts of interest. One of the things where your ethics come out as journalists is with conflicts of interest. My wife is a newsmaker. She is a public figure. She served about 16 years on the Muskogee County School Board. She currently sits on the Georgia Department of Transportation Board as one of 14 members from across the state. She runs a very successful nonprofit, the Columbus Housing Initiative, NeighborWorks Columbus, that helps provide fit and affordable housing for a lot of people. What she does is news. She's had 2 developments, one up on 4th Avenue in North Highland, one down off Victory Drive, Elliott's Walk, that are newsworthy. When it comes to Kathy, I have to back out. I have to step out. Phil has picked up some of those stories that I couldn't touch. And traditionally, she would be somebody I would be covering a lot. But we've been married for 20 years now. We've had kind of a relationship in that there are things we can't talk to each other about because she doesn't need to have her integrity questioned and I don't need to have my integrity questioned. And there are literally sometimes things that break, and somebody said, you had to have known that. No, I didn't know that. More so with the school board now. But DOT has got a lot going on as well, and then certainly NeighborWorks. But, I'm very proud of her. And when we married, Mike Burbach, the editor I was talking about a minute ago, Mike pulled me into his office and he said, I'm fixing to give you some advice and you better listen, and you better listen good. Mike says, when y'all get married, there are going to be people in this town that are going to think she gave you every story you got because she's in rooms where those stories are talked about. He said, my advice to you is go get sourced. Get so well sourced, people have no clue where your information's coming from. And I took that advice to heart, and I think if you look, I'm very proud of my sourcing. My sourcing is I've got a lot of different tentacles out there in a lot of different places, and sometimes you may think you know where I got something, but a lot of times you're wrong because it came from a different direction. So get well sourced. And conflicts of interest, it is what it is. Let me make sure. I'm very fortunate. I get to work with these people every day and others, but particularly Phil and Teresa, we sit in a row there. I sit next to Phil. And, when When you make ethical decisions in today's world, you need sounding boards. You need somebody to say, whoa, wait a minute, what are you thinking about? And I am fortunate. If you look at that picture right there, I mean, you see a lot of different things, but what I see is over 100 years of journalistic experience covering this community. I mean, you're not going to see that many other places. And three people standing there. I mean, Phil, how many? You've got well over 30, right? 33. Teresa's got that, and then I've got that. I mean, it is, you know, it's fortunate. And I will tell you a story that happened last week. We had an abduction of 2 children. Brittany was all over that, providing information to the local media outlets. And because the kids were abducted, they had to put out their names. They had to put out their names and their pictures. We're looking for these 2 children, 11-year-old, 4-year-old. So police department does that. Well, 24 hours or less later, how long did it take y'all to find them? About 24 hours. They found the kids in South Georgia. They were okay. Arrested the mother. She had lost custody of the children. It was an abduction. The kids were in DFACS foster care. Well, they've already put out the pictures and the names. And I was doing the court story where the details of what happened came out. And, you know, we had images of 2 of the 3 kids. And I done my story and talked to Vian and I talked to Phil. And I showed them, I said, this doesn't feel right. It didn't feel right to use the kids' pictures, but for 2 reasons, ethical reasons. One, we don't identify minor victims. As a rule, we do not identify minors who are the victims of crime. And also in that courtroom, the police officer, the detective testified that the children were victims of physical and sexual physical and sexual abuse. Abuse was the word they used. And we certainly don't identify victims of any age of sexual abuse. That's our policy, and it's a sound policy. But after talking to Phil, and I think I could have easily run the pictures because they were in the domain, Phil's like, don't do it. And, you know, and that's the cool part about working in a newsroom where ethics and the community standards are kind of front and center. And I'm very fortunate to be able to do that. And, you know, and I know for a fact that these people are watching what the older folks do in that room on how we make decisions, what we do, our stuff, you know, so you kind of know that you're on display just about every day when you go in there. And I'm not always at my best, but I try to be. But I'm very fortunate to sit next to Phil, because when you talk about integrity, and I could say this about a number of my colleagues, but I will say this about Phil. There's no more journalist in Columbus, Georgia, or this state that has more integrity than Phil Scoggins. And it's an honor and a privilege to be able to work with him. And it's an honor and a privilege to be able to work with Teresa. She has loads of integrity, and she knows this community better than most of us. And I get to work with Jeswal too. Okay, this is kind of the meat of what I'm going to talk about. We talk about ethics as black and white, right and wrong. Many of the ethical decisions that I have to make, that we have to make as journalists, are made in what I call the gray area. It's not as clear-cut as you would think. And I will go back 20 years to a very painful and tragic chapter in this city's history. How many of y'all are aware of Kenny Walker? How many people in this community know who Kenny Walker was and what happened to him? Kenny Walker was an African American, worked at Blue Cross Blue Shield, husband, father, fraternity member. In December of 2003, he was shot to death on I-185 between the Manchester and Macon Road exits by a Muskogee County Sheriff's deputy working with a tactical unit that had a drug surveillance sting going. They had followed the SUV from what they thought. They thought the SUV had Miami drug dealers in it, and they had followed it from a location, made the stop on 185. The sheriff's deputy violated a number of the sheriff's office's policies, including finger on the trigger during the thing, and shot Kenny Walker to death. It created an incredible amount of backlash. No drugs were found, no guns were found in the vehicle. I believe there were trace amounts of drugs in the autopsy on Walker, but the premise of the stop was there. So I was working at the newspaper at the time, and we were very aggressive in our pursuit of open records. We were filing lawsuits. We were bringing in lawyers out of Atlanta. We were arguing in front of judges. We were trying to get files that the Muskogee County Sheriff's Office didn't want us to have at the time. They were using the exemption under Georgia law that it was under investigation. Well, eventually, Glisson did not cooperate with the internal investigation, was terminated. The sheriff's deputy was terminated from his job. They took it before a grand jury, and the grand jury no-billed it, which meant they failed to indict him, no criminal charges. Created a whole nother uproar. A lot of people didn't think it was justice. Particularly a lot of people in our African American community, and a lot of very prominent people in our African American community. There were folks in the business community that were trying to calm the waters at that time. A lot going on. Well, our editor at the time was a guy named Ben Holden, who was a lawyer. He's the only lawyer I've ever worked for as an editor. And Ben made the decision we were going to go after grand jury testimony. We were going to go after what happened in that grand jury room. What was the vote? What was said? What did the DA present? There's only one problem with that decision. What happens in grand jury rooms in the state of Georgia is secret. Now, you can know who the grand jurors are when you see the indictment, the 18 or 20, is it 24 or 18, Ken? How many are 8? It's the number of grand jurors are listed by name. You know who they are. So we made a decision we were going to contact every one of those grand jurors and grant them anonymity and ask them to tell us what happened. I think we had 3, maybe 4 that talked to us. They told us from their view what happened in that room, their perspective, and some of it collaborated with the 3 or 4. But about a day into that, we had a district attorney here named Gray Conger. And Gray was the one it was presented by a special counsel, because they recused themselves, and I think an attorney from outside of Georgia presented it, if I remember correctly, maybe Albany. But Gray corners me in the government center by the elevators, and he comes up to me and he says, "I know what you're doing." And I had kind of been prepared for it. I knew he was getting calls from grand jurors that didn't want to talk to us saying, "Hey, these guys are calling us." And I said, "Gray, what I'm doing is not illegal." And he looked at me, and it's one of those moments where you just say, where am I? What do I do? He looked at me and said, "No, what you're doing is not illegal, but what you're asking them to do is." And he was right. I mean, I was asking them under the cover of anonymity to break the law. And, and I've thought long and hard about that over the last 20 years. That was a gray area ethical decision that I don't know even today if I was in the same situation, if I would pursue it the same way. I think I would, I probably would, but with the experience of going through that, we got information to the public that should have been in the public about that grand jury presentation. So I think we served the general public in the quest for knowledge, but we were clearly, we were asking people, normal citizens, people like y'all, to break the law. And, and that's a strange place to be, and it's a very, very, very uncomfortable place to be as a journalist. And it's one of those things that I think about it a lot, sort of how I still think about those types of decisions as I move forward with my job every day. I'm going to tell you now, first of all, I'm going to talk about the picture. That was shot on Lake Michigan, Saugatuck, Michigan, this summer. And I'm using it because you have to be at peace with yourself sometimes. And to me, that is a very peaceful picture. That was a great day of vacation in Michigan. That started in downtown Chicago. The morning of a Taylor Swift concert with all the Swifties coming in. But I'm going to tell you now about the only time in my career that I have ever been what I call personnel file written up. It went in my personnel file. I honestly thought I might get terminated for it. And Marion knows a little bit about this. Her boss was a guy named Larry Sanders. Larry was a very good, outstanding healthcare executive. He ran Columbus Regional, and a lot of what you see today, Larry built. But there was a hospital war going on then. St. Francis was locally controlled at the time, and the two hospitals shared some things, but they were fighting. They were fighting each other on certificates of needs. The two hospitals, were going at each other on a regular basis, and there were people, very respected people in this community on both sides of it. And Larry was kind of at the middle. You either loved Larry or he was Darth Vader. And he was one of those guys, or is one of those guys, you had very strong feelings about him. And I had recently started doing long form, reporting intense long form journalism. Larry had colon cancer. It was preventable. If he had gotten a colonoscopy earlier, Larry would not have been in the situation he was in. Dang near killed him. It certainly affected his ability over probably a 12-month period to run that organization. So it was news in that respect. But I approached Larry with an idea, and I went around the PR people to do it. By the time they knew it was happening, it was already happening. Was that a fair statement?
More than fair.
So I approached Larry and I said, share your story. I said, you're on every prayer list in this town. He was on prayer lists where they probably would have taken a vote at some of the churches to see if he should have stayed on the prayer list. But he was on prayer lists all over this town. I said, what you're going through, one, just the irony of you running the largest healthcare system in the community, and you basically didn't go get your colonoscopy, and now look what you're dealing with. And he thought about it long and hard. We had a number of conversations, and he finally agreed to talk to me. And I thought it was going to be one interview, see what we got. It ended up being about 6 or 7 interviews. One of them lasted 7.5 hours. It was amazing, the stuff. He took me to his farm. He let me into his world. He basically, the world that a lot of people didn't know about this guy. So this guy, who some people loved and some people didn't love, all of a sudden he showed me the human side of it. I got to see it really well. And I went back, and with the help of Diamond Kendrick Holmes, who was my editor, we wrote this series that ended up 6 or 7 parts. Synovus ended up taking it and putting it in a pamphlet about Larry, it was about the business, it was about the cancer. Here's this guy, we laid him out there. He laid himself out there bare for this community. We had a rule at the Ledger Enquirer, and it's in our handbook, and the rule is you do not show the finished product to sources before it publishes. Hard and fast rule. And there are ways to get around it in some ways, like, and I've done this with a number of people in this room. I'll call you and read you what I'm going to quote you as saying. So what you said to me is your property anyway, and if it's got quote marks around it, I can fact check it that way. Well, I made a decision because there were so many ways I could make mistakes on this story. I wanted Larry to see it, but I knew as soon as he saw it, I was in big fat trouble. And if he saw it before I published it, I mean, today there's a way to get around that. You just put it online before, real quick, and then say any corrections that need to be made. There are different ways to do it now, but I wasn't going to change a single word because he wanted it changed. I was looking for facts that were wrong, for names of family, anything that I could have gotten wrong that would have screwed the story up. And my bosses, I told my bosses, they didn't have to find out. I told my bosses what I'd done. They called me into a meeting, and I honestly thought they were about to terminate me. And I'm like, okay, about time to go into PR. I'm fixing to make the career switch. They suspended me for one day, right there in that building. They suspended me for one day, and this was at 8:30 in the morning. So I got a full day to think about this. And I can be reactionary at times. So I went straight to one of my friends and mentors, Billy Wynn's house. Billy lived on front. I walked in and Billy goes, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "You got any coffee?" And he said, "Yeah." So let's talk. And so I told Billy what had happened. Billy goes, "You screwed up." And I said, "Yeah, I know it." He said, "But I would have done the same thing." And I just would have been a little more careful about the way I did it. But Billy and I talked, and Billy, I said, "What do I do?" I said, I've been embarrassed. What do I do now? Billy says, "Man, just keep doing what you're doing. Walk into the paper tomorrow morning, do your job like this never happened." Said, "Just go in and do what you do." And I probably, if I hadn't talked to Billy, might have quit that day or might have done something stupid. And and that's why you seek counsel of older folks. But Billy kind of convinced me, sometimes these things happen. But I say that for this reason and this reason alone. Sometimes the written policy and what your personal ethics are, they clash. They aren't the same. And you've got to make a decision on how you handle that, but you also have to make a decision that you're willing to accept the consequences. And I see Joe and Connor, they're kind of smirking at me now, but I'm very careful about that stuff. I try to be. Any number of things can happen, but that is, and I thought about sharing that because Mary did, that story fairly well. And, it was just one of those things that happens, and, because ethics is not black and white. It's gray. It is definitely gray. Let's get to the end of this now. We are cooking with gas. Bill Warriors is a journalist, one of the best journalists I think who's operated in the last half of the century. Our very lives depend on the ethics of strangers, and most of us are always strangers to other people. So ethics are intertwined. A doctor's ethics could impact my life. My ethics could impact somebody I cover's life. It's all intertwined. A lot of times we're strangers. And I'm going to finish this off with another quote from Warriors. Early in his career, he was President Johnson's press secretary. "News is what people want to keep hidden. Everything else is publicity." That is the rub. That's where ethics rubs. When you are a journalist in a smaller community, a community of 206,000, and I've heard Skip say it, the mayor say it, but 206 plus thousand people. There's a rub. There's a rub because my job is to report accurately and fairly news, and that's what I try to do. Last slide. We got about 10, 15 minutes left, and we can do questions and answers if you have any. And this picture I chose because I did a tag out from behind the desk one day, and one of the things I've seriously considered going into politics until about the last 2 months, and I'm like, nah, I would not be a very good politician. But see, I tried out the mayor's desk, and I don't look good in it. It's not a fit for me. So if we want to start, does anybody have any questions? No. I had his mother's name misspelled. I had his mother's name misspelled, and I had one other thing that was wrong that had to do with his educational background, because I think he was a UAB guy. There were a bunch of them at that time that came out of the UAB health management or medical management stuff, and including Michael Garrigan, who was the CEO of St. Francis at the time. But I mean, it was a real hospital war. It was great for a reporter, a great place to be, but it was a real hospital war at the time. Anybody else? Yeah. I kept failing at everything I did, and they kept promoting me. No, I made a decision in the 8th grade that I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be a sports writer because I knew I was never going to play the game. So I wanted to be able to go to the games, and I did. I was very fortunate. I became sports editor at the Ledger Enquirer in 1991, and the Ledger staff has dwindled significantly. In 1991, I had a sports staff of 14 people, bureaus in Athens, Atlanta, and Auburn. I had a $250,000 correspondent budget where we covered Tuscaloosa, and I had a travel budget. We went on the road some with the Braves. I mean, we had an amazing, amazing budget. And that was the year that everything sports-wise changed around here. Braves went from worst to first. Atlanta gets the Olympics. Columbus gets the softball venue for the Olympics. So a lot of things sports really mattered. And I coordinated our Olympic effort I was sports editor through 97. I coordinated the Olympic effort. And fortunately for me, I tried to get a job at the HAC after the Olympics. I didn't get it, and I was, sometimes the best prayer answer is no. I ended up going to the news side in 97. I did 3 years as Metro editor, and then I decided I did not want to be a boss anymore. I was supervising about 35 people at the time, and I decided that I just wanted to supervise me, and that's pretty much what I have done over the last 23 years. I've pretty much supervised me, and that I'm a terrible employee. So I would not want to be my boss. I would not want to be my boss.
Well, first of all, for another session, Connor, maybe you can talk about what's like being Chuck's boss. My question, Chuck, is so we've seen two big leaps in journalism. We've seen the leap to the 24/7 news cycle, and we've seen the leap to digital coverage and the speed in which that happens. How would you say that's affected ethics and integrity?
I think today journalists are far more tired than they were before, because as long as you've got this phone, your boss can always get you. You can always get your emails. You get your text. So you are constantly plugged in. Used to, I knew I could go home, turn it off, and I could get away from it unless they called my home landline. I think that has made journalists more tired. I think our profession is in an ethical crisis, and I think part of it is confusion with what reporters do and what commentators do. I think that's a big part of our ethical crisis that we face right now. I'm not a commentator. I'm a gumshoe reporter. I go out on the street. And it's interesting because one of the things when I came to the TV side, I thought I was ethically superior. I quickly found out I wasn't. I've watched Phil and Teresa operate, and to this day, I couldn't tell you what their political leanings are, and I've been with them each 5 years. Phil and Teresa take great pains to be right down the middle. They are the conscience of the newsroom, and they are the conscience of the community in many ways. And I think we are in a crisis, but I think local news is where some of the best reporting is being done. I mean, I'll tell you right now, I think some of the best reporting in the country is being done by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution right now on all of the Trump court stuff, and that's essentially local news. And I know many of those reporters know them well. I think that's some of the best, but I think we are in a situation, you know, I'm a few years away from retirement right now, so, you know, I don't think I'm the answer. I think people like this are going to have to figure out what the ethical situation is moving forward. And you know, I'll tell you this. I mean, I watch her she makes hundreds of decisions every day about news content and where it's stacked in our 6 o'clock show and our 11 o'clock show. A lot of those are ethical decisions, and you know, so I mean, how old are you, Vivian, if you don't mind me asking?
21.
That's a 21-year-old woman who is making these decisions and making them well. And I mean, in making them where she's got Phil and Teresa, Connor, Joe, everybody looking over her shoulder. She's got me screaming, I want more time. I mean, she's got all these various issues that, you know, that was a change from newspaper. You said, can you give me a few more inches? And now it's like, can you give me another 30 seconds?
You got 2:30.
But I will tell you the definite difference between newspaper and TV. I could always get 5 more minutes on deadline at the newspaper. It never failed. At 5:59, I can't get 5 more minutes anymore. It's like step up and do it. I mean, so it's much more pressure packed.
That's when the hecklers kick in. I think I'm going to challenge you with what may turn into a question. So stick with it.
Okay.
You talked about your ethical commitment in terms of your commitment to your sources, and I appreciate that as one of your sources.
I didn't out you. You outed yourself.
But I know you well enough to know that you also are trying to tell a story that is true. Not just because of the sources, but because you know this community, you know these people. And for the benefit of communications managers in the room, I will refer you to, I hope y'all know that we are in a national and international news crisis. United Foundation and Gallup have done a lot of polling work on trust in journalism. The good news for local journalism is that that's sort of where trust begins and ends. And I think it's because people not recognize that those are people they know, those are people who are committed to telling their story well. So don't shortchange yourself from that standpoint, because I know you well enough to know that's part of what makes you tick.
Well, and that's why I told the Alton story. I mean, because that's what it's a. I mean, if you know me, I mean, and you know, and there's some in this room that know me well, and there are others like Brittany that are trying to figure me out right now, and
I totally support you giving them a hard time.
hey, she's very good at what she does. She's very. I think Michael's given up trying to figure me out, but.
So you have an ethical obligation to report the truth. What is your ethical obligation when you interview someone and they're clearly not telling the truth and spewing information that is false?
Sometimes that doesn't air. Sometimes I'll make a decision that sometimes I will correct it, or I will get another source that is counter to it to correct it. You know, and this has come up more in the political side in the recent, in the last, since 2016. And, you know, and I'll go back to, hold on, I guess we're cut off. But, oh, no. I'll go back to Raffensperger. in many ways, Raffensperger was the counter to the narrative that some Republicans, many Republicans, the former president, were spewing out that the election was stolen. Brad Raffensperger, a Republican, had all the facts available to him in his job. And he and the governor by proxy said, no, we did not have stolen elections in Georgia. It didn't happen. I will now, if somebody says that, I may say in the report, there's no evidence, there's no credible evidence that the election was stolen. So that's one of the ways I get around that. Does that make sense? Is there anything specific you're talking about?
That was exactly what I was talking about.
Not a question, Chuck, just kind of a statement. You've joked a few times about making your boss's life difficult, but I can say, and this is really for more younger reporters or folks that want to get into our industry, we need more Chucks. We need more challenge. Chuck will go to my office probably once a week and say, you're going to get a call from somebody. And I welcome it because I know Chuck. I know Chuck is challenging or digging on a story. And I think it's very easy to just accept everything everyone says, be a young journalist, and go to your online story or package that night and put it in there.
Well, I will tell you what, it's not just me, and some of the younger journalists in our room, we have a public official in this community that sometimes steps a little further than the description of his job should, and we've got younger reporters that say, okay, we're going to keep our reporting, based on what this person can or can't officially talk about, and sometimes, and I'm not criticizing other stations, but you'll see things that we may not report because in other places because we've kind of curtailed that. That's an ethical decision that we've made. I mean, and that started with some of the younger reporters going, whoa, wait a minute, we're getting this wrong. So we have people in our room. I mean, we got some really, and over the last 5 years, have had some really talented young people. And I guess this is kind of how I'll end, if there's not another question. My advantage is I'm 63 years old. I'm going to retire in this job unless Joe O'Connor fire me. But I'm going to retire doing this. You know that. Everybody that deals with me knows I'm not going anywhere. Most of the people at our station, the reporters, most of the reporters across town at Channel 9, they're here for 2 years, some maybe 3. They are rocket ships. They're in the job to get the stories, to get the clips, to get the portfolio, to get the files, and then they want to go to Birmingham, or they want to go to Miami, or they want to go to Charlotte, or they want to go to Nashville. They want to go to Sacramento. They want to go somewhere. And this is where they're learning to do that. So when a reporter, sometimes there are sources that, quite frankly, will only talk to me or Liz, and they've said that because they know myself and Liz White aren't going anywhere, and we got to be accountable for what we do. And and it's not about. I mean, I don't even have a reel. I all the stories I've done, reporters build reels, and that's their resume essentially. I don't have a reel. I've never had a reel in 5 years. I couldn't tell you what would be on it because I go from one story to the next because I don't need a reel to get another job. Does that make sense?
So, do you mind if I can add, just because you won't say this, but basically what we do, we want people to trust what we say. We want them to believe that what we're giving them, to the best of our knowledge, is the truth. We want to be trusted. This week, we had a vote about to take place in the House. The Republican caucus was meeting, going into a session about the speaker situation, and Chuck he actually started with the communications specialist for Drew Ferguson, and then got some, maybe was able to make some inroads, but didn't get
a commitment to an interview.
So Chuck made the decision to send Congressman Ferguson a text, and
The text I sent to Congressman Ferguson, who I've covered since he was the mayor of West Point, was,
Might I add, stressed the ever-living deal out of me.
yeah, I changed her show at 6 o'clock.
Fourth time.
I was like, Drew, you got one hell of a story here. Please trust me with it. He had flipped his vote from Jim Jordan to Scalise. And he's my favorite text response ever. Going into a meeting at 4, we'll call you afterwards. That was the meeting with Jim Jordan that he was going into. He called me at 4:50 and we got it on the air at 6. And he explained why he had done it. He talked about the death threats against him and his family. And as of...
You asked him in that text, read what you read today. I think you read that. Trust me.
Yeah, I said trust. I said, you've got a hell of a story here. Trust me to tell it.
And he did.
And he did. And, you know, because he's been dealing with me forever. And, you know, and I've got a problem that I sometimes call people that I should call by title, like Congressman Ferguson. I call him Drew. I have trouble calling Mayor Henderson's anything but Skip. I mean, and I know people think it's a sign of disrespect. It's actually, you'll always be Dr. Brown to me now. I'm not going to Frank, but no, I mean, it really is. Relationships matter. I asked you 100 questions, Brittany. I know you got one.
Not necessarily a question, but one thing I can appreciate about you is that you are aggressive, you will be investigative journalism, and you don't need that from me. I wish that, some of the young reporters would take note. And I know that when you come to the police department, and I don't always have to go back and double check your story, fact check it or anything like that. But, I do find myself oftentimes talking to some of the other reporters like, hey, won't necessarily talk to the chief about heartbreakings or a specific murder case, but I have investigators here who can, talk about certain things. But when you want to talk to the chief, these are the type of things that we'll talk with them about. And I would send them your links, like, hey, think of things like this along the way, like stories that you've done in your work. So I am proud to work with you.
Well, thank you. That means a lot.
You do your homework, which helps us look like we know what we're doing too.
Well, I mean, you've certainly been. I mean, you've certainly seen it in action. Yeah.
I remember you coming in our comments class and you told us a story about a source that you used to have and that bridge kind of burned because you covered a topic that kind of put him in a bad light. And like, I think you take a lot of pride in having a lot of sources. How are you maintaining them despite having scenarios where y'all might have butt heads?
Ethically, you got to know when the truth is more important than the source. And I will tell you right now, that source I was talking about is a sitting Superior Court judge. You don't get the whole truth, but you try to get the best available version of the truth. And the person never called and said, I got it wrong. And they would have. They would have called my bosses and said, you got it wrong. They usually call and say, I don't like the way Chuck acted. I don't like Chuck's aggressiveness. I don't like Chuck. But it's funny, when you get complaints in the newsroom, if they start, if they start without a context or something like that, but if somebody calls up and says, hey, you got this wrong, this is inaccurate, I stop everything I'm doing and start asking questions. Because when somebody says it's wrong or inaccurate, I want to know what it is. I want to know how do I fix it.
And for those of you, and I know you've got one more thing I'd like to say, for those of you who may be thinking about being one of these sources one day, when your boss calls you in and gives you a little bit of brief about something that Chuck has done, what you say is anything that Chuck reported wrong? guarantee you, they will have to backpedal because they can't answer that question in the affirmative. You know, you might not like what you heard, but was anything wrong? And Chuck, I know you have to run. Do we have any time at all for a little update on the News Bureau?
That Joe or Connor, y'all want to give an update on where the Bureau stands?
Days, weeks, we're very, very close to it. If you don't know, this is the WRBL, new WRBL News Bureau back here. Yeah. It's locked right now, but you can peer through the windows. We're setting some stuff up. We're gonna get lights up, and then we'll be ready to roll. We'll be working out here. You'll see Chuck a lot down here. I would imagine Hannah. If she didn't know.
She just left. She left.
Hannah will be down here working, and we'll have a full capability of a second studio, essentially.
I tell you what, y'all won't see me in the WRBL main office once that opens. Now that I figured out how to send stuff in remotely.
I know y'all said it's not ready. I do have a key if you'd like to open it up, but that's up to y'all.
That's Connor and Joe's
Is there a
call.
move toward a journalism major? Is there a move?
That's a Dr. Gibson question.
I was gonna say, I can't even
Also about
say
a
that.
journalism measure,
Yeah.
about the fact
No, not, if I can speak for that. We have not talked about the journalism major. I know the English department has, something going, in terms of the kinds of courses they are offering. We have been talking with each other. But ideally, yes, we should have a journalism program here.
I want to be in a chair in residence if you do that.
how are you on time?
I've got to be out of here in 5 minutes.
Okay, everybody, let's thank Chuck for his time and a great presentation.
Thank you.